Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and good day to all of you joining the webinar series organized by Center for Global Higher Education. This is Joshua Mo from Hang Seng University of Hong Kong as a co-organizer of the Universities and Ideas series. And we are so glad today to have Professor Adam Nelson from University of Wisconsin-Madison to talk to us. And for a free seminar series under the Ideas and University Dialogue lectures, because now we are facing the impact of political economy, and also more importantly, I think higher education globally has been affected by the geopolitics. So the free webinar, I want to put people together to reflect upon how geopolitics has affected higher education from different continents and aspect. Today, we are so fortunate to have Professor Adam Nelson to join us. He will address us a topic, the political economy of higher education in early America. So without further ado, I will hand over to Adam. It's your floor, and you can speak about 35 minutes and then leaving some time for question and comment. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Kaho, and thanks for including me in this series. Thanks everybody for attending today. I have a lot that I want to say, so I'm going to dive right in. My goal today is to really think together about some of the challenges facing higher education, probably around the world, through the lens of political economy. And to do that, I've chosen a story from some of my current research about higher education in the early American Republic. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Give me a second. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. So over the past couple years, I've been working on this, let's see here, topic, and have written a couple books about this that are shown here. It's really the first one that I'm going to draw from today. To get us oriented, though, I thought that I would offer a few thoughts about sort of political economy and higher education in our own time. And it's really a way of thinking about the perceived value of higher education and having debates about what the value of higher education is. And so sometimes we talk about the private value of higher education, often using frames like return on investment or the technology transfer that can result from university research. We sometimes think about the private value of higher education in terms of internationalization or globalization and the flow of students that are seeking credentials that have value for themselves, or even on an individual level, the social networks and personal and intellectual growth that can accrue to those who pursue higher education. And sometimes, of course, we talk about the public value of higher education. I hope we talk about it a lot in terms of the production of educated citizens and public expertise. National competitiveness, of course, is often construed as a public value of higher education, and the scientific and humanistic development that can result from what universities do. Certainly here in the United States, and perhaps where you are, we're thinking about these issues in a context of diminished government support for higher education. This has been going on for some time now. And relatedly, we're seeing increased tuition costs for higher education and a concern about decreasing labor market returns for especially first degree students. And we can't ignore the larger technological context of the political economy of higher education and disruptive technologies that we've seen. Disruption, of course, for some people is a virtue and other people is a vice, especially the rise of online degrees accelerated by COVID and the big topic of our own time now, artificial intelligence. So here, let's see if I can get my computer to advance this. There we go. I want to draw our attention to a particular aspect of the debates about the value of higher education that's really gaining a lot of attention here in the United States, which has to do with the value of critical thinking, the public value of critical thinking, the private value of being a critical thinker, and the cultural politics that are surrounding that concept. Of course, on the one hand, many of us see critical thinking as perhaps the core skill or disposition of a higher education, or especially a liberal arts education, and its contribution to democratic citizenship. And we think of critical thinking and the value of critical thinking for society in terms of viewpoint diversity, the ability to have participation equity, or many different kinds of people bringing their backgrounds and perspectives to the classroom, to research, and so on. And the idea that critical thinking is related somehow to discursive inclusion, many different discourses, frames, epistemologies, ways of thinking and knowing that the university cherishes. But increasingly, we're seeing from mostly conservative critics of higher education in the United States, the idea that critical thinking as a value has actually promoted viewpoint uniformity in universities. Perhaps even forms, from the conservatives' perspective, of participation inequity, as if there's some kind of lack of fair and equal access to the university space. And this has led to criticisms about discursive inclusion in the university. People are talking about the rise of identity enclaves, safe spaces, trigger warnings, speech codes, regulation. We hear a lot about this in the global higher education media. And from the mostly conservative point of view, there's a fear that the very promotion of critical thinking in the university has a leftist bias to it. And this comes from those who want to bring forward more traditionalist or conservative ideas within the university space. In the United States, this is often from religious conservatives who have felt that the university, as an increasingly secular institution, has excluded them and is not, in fact, as open as it purports to be. Relatedly, I put this in brackets because it's similar and related, but also a little bit different in this space, are debates about the history of affirmative action in the political economy, of access to higher education, construed by conservatives as anti-white discrimination now. Famously, the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case in 2023 basically put the Supreme Court majority on that side. So in sum, increasingly, the cultural politics of critical thinking as it relates to big debates about the political economy and desirability of higher education have led to critiques of wokeism in the university as a space of academic, not liberalism, but illiberalism. So into this mix comes the Trump administration. And the Trump administration has had a rapid and, for many, unsettling effect on the political economy of higher education in the United States. And as probably all of you are familiar with, has taken various steps against universities. It has withheld federal research grants on the pretext of anti-Semitism or wokeism in the university that the Trump administration alleges is suppressing or distorting freedom of thought and expression. The administration has extracted financial settlements from a set of mostly elite universities to resolve legal claims brought by the Trump administration's Justice Department against universities, and has promised grants to universities that sign a compact with the administration. Among the universities that have settled with the administration but have not signed the compact are the University of Pennsylvania, University of Virginia, Brown, Cornell, Columbia, Northwestern. Perhaps around the corner are stepped up threats to accreditation for universities that do not align or comply with the administration's agenda. And if accreditation is threatened or removed, that would affect eligibility for student loans, which could jeopardize many institutions' financial stability or even survival. And as we know, the Trump administration has also revoked visas for international students and has deported undocumented students. So we're in a period of heightened debate about the value of higher education in our public discourse. And that is really a debate about the political economy that surrounds universities in the United States. Many people are starting to wonder if these institutions are inherently not just political, but politicized. And if they are, then some pretty fundamental questions come to the fore. If higher education institutions are politicized, should they receive public support? And if they do, should that public support be offered only in exchange for heightened public supervision? You see this sort of in the frame of what the Trump administration wants to do. If there's public support, there should be greatly heightened public oversight for universities. Or alternatively, if these institutions are in fact politicized, then perhaps they should support themselves with more private forms of resources, either tuition from those who choose to attend a particular university instead of another, or the donations from philanthropists, donors who choose to support one institution as opposed to another. All of this, I think, amounts to a set of questions, some might say a confusion about the relative role of the state and the market in structuring the higher education sector. If we divide that very, very roughly, this is obviously a gross oversimplification of sort of the public and the private, the government versus what's increasingly construed as just corporate politicization of knowledge production. Then we have some emerging questions about which side of that debate is more likely to protect a value like academic freedom. If the government is very, very politicized, will it protect academic freedom? But if, on the other hand, the private support for universities through corporate influence is equally politicized, will it protect academic freedom? So these are some of the debates that are emerging around the political economy of higher education today. It has to do with funding universities and overseeing or controlling universities. So I'm here to suggest that these debates are not new. These kinds of questions, these kinds of worries have been around for a very long time. And as an historian, I find it useful to take a step back, perhaps a big step back into a different time to see how very similar debates played out so that we can gain some perspective on our own time. And to do that, I'd like to bring us back to the early American Republic. Next year will be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And so there are lots of preparations for that event. And for me, it's an opportunity to reflect on the political economy of higher education in an earlier period, because the American Revolution posed some pretty important questions about the purpose of higher education in a capitalist democracy, or what they would have thought of as not quite a democracy, but an early republic. And they wondered very explicitly how a modern academic marketplace should be structured. How should universities serve society? How should universities serve the state? But in the early, newly independent United States, of course, government was extremely weak. The forces of capital far exceeded government power or resources or capacity in that moment. So I'm asking myself as an historian, in that context, a revolutionary context in which education was actively politicized, the questions arose. Should colleges, universities seek public support in exchange for public supervision in this new state structure, or should they seek private support? And for them, the fundamental question was, which of those options would better advance the revolution's ideals of Republican self-government? Republican self-government. So, in order to get into this discussion from their perspective, I've chosen a particular case, the College of Philadelphia, which we now know as the University of Pennsylvania, one of the universities that's been in the news here in the United States in the last year or so. And tell you a little bit about its history. And I'm going to do this in 4 very quick stages that are outlined here. So let's begin. So the College of Philadelphia was founded by Ben Franklin. And he created this school as an academy in 1750, but quickly made it a college in 1755. And in this context of colonial America, colonial Pennsylvania, the colonial governments really controlled higher education markets within each colony. There was only one college per colony. The colonial governments did not allow competing colleges within their colonies for most of the colonial period. Not until the very end of the colonial period did that change. And the college in a colony received forms of public support, usually associated with the colony's established church. So, for example, Harvard was connected to the congregation, well, originally the Puritans, but the Congregational Church in Massachusetts, which was Massachusetts' established church. The colony collected taxes for the church, and some of those taxes supported the college. And that was also true with William and Mary in Virginia, which was associated with Virginia's established church, the Anglicans, or the Church of England. Over time, as each colony created its college, it received public support if aligned with the established church. These were, we could say, public institutions in many ways associated with the colonial state. Yale in Connecticut, associated with its established Congregationalist church. Princeton in New Jersey was the first to break the mold and say, we're going to be independent. We are a dissenter. They were a Presbyterian college. And in exchange for our independence, we will not receive any public support. The next was King's College. We now know it as Columbia in New York, associated with the Anglican established church. And then our college for today's story, the College of Philadelphia in 1755. Ben Franklin made it a college after the creation of King's so that he could steal students away from New York into Pennsylvania, because his school would be also a college. And that was the marketplace across the colonies. Each colony wanted to attract students from other colonies into its own higher education market. It was a highly mercantilist system where they would not allow competitors within their own colony, but try to attract students from other colonies. So, one of the things that made Ben Franklin's school unique was that it was the first to declare itself non-sectarian. He hoped that it could attract students from all religious groups across all of the colonies to Pennsylvania. It was probably too idealistic because the rector he chose was an Anglican. And that rector tried to make the college into an Anglican college, just like the ones in other Anglican colonies. Okay, that's the background for our institution, which brings us then up to the Revolution. And the Revolution affected the college profoundly. During the war, the revolutionary government in Pennsylvania took over the college, basically dismantled it, and made a formerly independent College of Philadelphia into a state-controlled University of the State of Pennsylvania. And in order to understand how that happened, it's important to understand two branches of Republican ideology in the Revolutionary period. On the one hand were the commercial Republicans, who advocated free trade, they advocated for open exchange, free movement across colonies, lots more interaction. On the other hand were those who considered themselves civic or Commonwealth Republicans, who emphasized basically state power. They wanted a unified set of virtuous citizens who would govern themselves for the sake of the public interest. They were much less oriented toward free movement and free exchange. In Pennsylvania, that's the group that took over in an extreme form in the revolutionary moment. They were, I think we could safely describe them as populists who wanted total control of government, including all its institutions. And they took over the College of Philadelphia and replaced it with the University of the State of Pennsylvania. They imposed an oath of political loyalty on the faculty, insisting on partisan allegiance to their group. They seized the private assets of the College of Philadelphia and turned them over to the state and its institution, the University of the State of Pennsylvania. They imposed a new curriculum on the institution that was not classical. Instead, it emphasized practical arts and useful sciences because they were profoundly anti-elitist in their view of education. And they insisted on providing public support for this new institution only in exchange for tightly controlled public service with heavy supervision of the college. So during the Revolution, we see a consolidation of state control over the sole institution of higher education at that time in Pennsylvania. This was a completely state-controlled university claiming to work in the public interest. Well, this made a lot of people unhappy. Many of the faculty at that institution were so upset by the control that the state had exerted, they began to advocate for competing institutions so that they could have alternatives to this very tight state control on the university. And one of the people who had been a member of the faculty at the College of Philadelphia was Benjamin Rush, who took steps to create two new colleges very shortly after this takeover of his institution. One was Dickinson College, the other was Franklin College, both in the middle part of the state. And Benjamin Rush represented what he considered sort of a voice of moderation to oppose the populist power in the state government. And his voice of moderation had started to gain ground, not just in Pennsylvania, but nationally, as the crises of the revolution and the weakness of the initial government became apparent. And increasingly, that moderate group led the charge for a new constitution for the United States. And the Constitution Convention took place in 1787 when Franklin College was founded, was ratified in 1788 by the requisite number of states, and finally fully ratified in 1790, which was the year Ben Franklin died. And that new constitution represented sort of a conservative reaction in Pennsylvania to the populist control of government. By that time, the moderates had taken over the Pennsylvania legislature, and they reinstated the independence of the original College of Philadelphia and made it into the University of Pennsylvania, the institution we know today. So that institution was then privately reincorporated to foster advanced scholarship and what they hoped would be a more moderate politics. Okay, so we're starting to see a flip-flop between sort of state control and a reaction against it in terms of private universities that hoped to have their independence. Well, all of that was happening, the reincorporation of the University of Pennsylvania, in a context that was transatlantically complex and alive. The French Revolution had begun, and the French Revolution had a profound effect on these debates in the United States about whether true Republican ideals would be more represented by public control or private freedoms institutionally in the higher education sector. So I want to tell a little, very brief story about how that played out at Dickinson College, one of the institutions Benjamin Rush created. This was a context of extreme political polarization, those who supported the French Revolution and those who opposed the French Revolution. And this led to new forms of institutional competition as universities had to take sides, either radically liberal or conservative in reaction to the French Revolution. And at Dickinson, this led to what I think we could safely call culture wars at the college. On the one side were the people supporting the revolution who proposed a radical democratization of the college. They wanted students to be able to complete a college degree in 1 year. They wanted to radically level access to the university. Anybody could come. They didn't really even have to have prior education to show up at the university. They promoted sort of an anti-elitist outlook that bled it almost into a form of anti-meritocracy itself. They wanted a much more practical curriculum in order to compete with a rising set of academies that offered a more practical education themselves. And finally, and most distressingly to the conservatives, they wanted the college to be non-sectarian, to the point that it would be secular. And in the 1790s in the United States, some saw that move toward non-sectarianism as secularism as a promotion of atheism in the college. This was sort of the 1790s version of radical leftism today in higher education. It too then provoked a conservative reaction. And the spokesman for that reaction at Dickinson was the president of the institution, Charles Nisbet. And he believed that the university, the college, had been hijacked by radical populist insurgents. He worried that this French influence was going to transform higher education. I have a little quotation here from Charles Nisbet, where he says, "In this day, everything is supposed to be so much improved in the present age that I should not be surprised to hear of students receiving degrees without any study at all." He worries that the entire higher education system will be dismantled by this radical group. So, at Dickinson, he defends the idea that the only way for Dickinson to escape this influence is to be a private corporation, self-governing, and that he perceives as the most Republican ideal, not state control, which now is associated with French centralization, not radical openness to new ideas and cosmopolitan internationalism, because that too would make the university susceptible to French influence. Instead, he wants to close ranks. He's actually sort of a neo-nationalist in 1790s terms, in a way that says only a privately incorporated institution can be protected from this outside force, which has the potential to take over the government. Okay, so this kind of debate played out in institution after institution during the 1790s. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to its effects. The French Revolution led to a whole set of changes in American politics, notably the election of Thomas Jefferson, and ultimately some aspects of the War of 1812. What I want to highlight is this extreme ideological polarization led to a politicization of colleges, not just within each institution, but across the whole sector. And the response to that politicization of colleges was a liberalization of the sector. The state was no longer going to attempt to control the institutions, what they taught, how they taught, or who they hired to teach. Instead, institutions could be free to pursue the approach they chose on their own. Some perceived this as a radical democratization of the higher education sector. Many kinds of institutions would serve many different ideologies. Others perceived this as a fragmentation of the higher education marketplace. What nobody could dispute was that the result of this resolution, sort of to open up the higher education sector to many institutions, was a proliferation of colleges that would be privately incorporated, fiercely competitive with one another, which tended to level down requirements for degrees. They would often be denominational, associated with particular religious perspectives. Increasingly, they would incorporate a much more practical curriculum, sort of to compete with each other for students who wanted skills-based employment opportunities. And because we're moving into what's called the antebellum period, they would be increasingly sectional, either associated with in the context of the debate over slavery, the anti-slavery North or the pro-slavery South. So our three institutions, the University of Pennsylvania, Dickinson, and Franklin, were quickly joined by the Franklin Institute, which was basically a mechanics institute that functioned like a college, Lafayette College, Gettysburg, Villanova, Bucknell, Muhlenberg, St. Joseph's, Ashman, or Lincoln, which was a historically black college in the context of the rising abolitionist movement. So what arose out of this political polarization was a liberalization of the higher education sector in which many, many different kinds of institutions emerged. They received little or no public financial support. That is until the Pennsylvania State University was created in 1855, and Pennsylvania State became Pennsylvania's land-grant university during the Civil War. So, to conclude, what we see in this period of revolutionary change in the American higher education sector was a shift from colonial quasi-public institutions to increasingly privately incorporated institutions. And this privatization or liberalization of the higher education market was a response to political polarization. And I would argue the failure of the civic or Commonwealth Republican ideals, which had hoped to hold the nation together around a shared understanding of common goals, sort of a public good Republican imagination. This privatization, though, was also not just about the failure of Commonwealth republicanism. It was also a form of protection against extreme populist government control, extreme state power and influence over higher education. But the side effect of all of this, which was not minor, was a retreat into rival nationalisms, sectional alliances, and ideological entrenchments as universities tried to distinguish themselves for a particular set of students and ideas. In this period, when there was a loss or lack of public financial support, in exchange for public service, I mean, if there was not going to be a direct service to the public, they were going to serve private interests. They were not going to receive, in that case, public financial support. That lack of public financial support became the next big question in the political economy of American higher education going forward. And the next big moment was the Civil War and the way in which that question about a lack of public support was addressed by what we call the Morrill Land Grant Act, which created the American land grant universities by using land appropriated from Native Americans to support higher education in the public service with agricultural, mechanical, and military education for the northern states, later extended to the southern states at the end of the century. So this story, I think, helps us think about some of the big issues in the political economy of higher education in an early period in ways that I think might help us think of the potential causes and consequences of changes in the political economy of higher education in our own time. So I'm going to stop there. I'm really looking forward to some discussion and hearing how some of these ideas resonate maybe with where you are in the world. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. A wonderful speech. And your historical account seems to suggest highly relevant to what we are experiencing in the contemporary time, especially talking about the privatization and marketization taking place in higher education. And thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. So I see some colleagues, they put into the chat, and can I invite Oliver Kills? Can ask the question? Because there's a chat room, there's a question being raised. Adam, can you hear? Can you see that?
I can see the question. I don't know if Oliver wants to turn on his camera, or maybe I should just read it for him.
Yeah, Oliver, can you turn on your camera?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much.
Please.
Thank you. This is very, very thought-provoking. I'm just wondering about kind of the practical elements that led up to this liberalization. You know, we talk about this proliferation of new institutions, and I'm just wondering if, you know, from a policy perspective, this is the result of perhaps either financial constraints or political leaders at the time are looking at this proliferation of new higher education institutions, maybe from different sectarian backgrounds, and essentially saying, we can't control this. We're just going to have to take just practically stop and saying, oh no, we're going to get out of this business. Or if this was more intentional in terms of like a desire to remove state control.
Mm-hmm. Great question. If I were to pick between those options, I would say the latter. We're going to get out of this business. We're going to let institutions of higher education make their own way, much more than sort of a coordinated, intentional policy direction. And to shed a little bit of light on that, in one of my later slides, I referenced very briefly the so-called Dartmouth case of 1819, which opens up this space for a proliferation of colleges. What happened in that case, and one of the books that I've recently been working on is about that case, the state of New Hampshire tried to take over Dartmouth College, just like the state of Pennsylvania took over the College of Philadelphia and made it into a public university. Well, later, New Hampshire tried to take over Dartmouth College and make it a public university. Actually, as I argue in my book, they probably had some pretty solid legal grounds to do so, but Dartmouth hired one of its alumni, Daniel Webster, as its lawyer, and he was a brilliant lawyer who persuaded the Supreme Court that that takeover was a violation of the college's corporate charter, which Daniel Webster construed as a private corporate charter. And that decision from the Supreme Court was the very first U.S. Supreme Court decision on American corporate law to protect privately incorporated institutions from forms of state regulation and oversight. One outcome of that case was that if an institution wanted public aid as it was seeking a charter, it usually had to write into the charter the ability of the state or the legislature to exert some oversight. Increasingly, institutions chose very strategically whether they wanted to seek public aid with the possibility of some kind of state oversight or forego public aid in order to protect themselves from what unwanted state control. And that new legal environment strongly shaped the next generation of college founding in this period. And many of these institutions chose to be privately incorporated and forego public aid.
Okay, quick answer. So can I invite Professor David Mills? Can you turn on your camera to ask a question? David.
Thanks, Kaho, and thank you, Adam. It was really fascinating. What I found particularly interesting is that we always think about the emergence of American higher education as a rush to the market, but actually what you're describing is a political economy that's driven much more by politics than by the economics, and which I find really, really interesting. So I guess my question, if you think about sort of historians of science, they do write about the role of dissensus as driving scientific debates and the importance almost of the university as a sort of a site of dissensus. I mean, is your argument one that we should what we've come back to is what should be seen as not an aberration, but actually as a moment in time where we're reminded of just how universities have long been caught up in larger political fights, and actually it's that larger politics that does shape what the university is for and how it evolves and how it responds to the environment in which it's in. So I mean, it seems to me that's the big case you're making, which is the importance of seeing beyond the university for understanding it. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that really, really terrific question. It raises a whole set of points about the relationship between the university and the economy, and also the economy of ideas within the university as driving innovation and so on and so forth. So I'll take those in turn. First, in this particular talk, I emphasized politics and ideological debates. Also, at the same time, the universities were powerfully affected by broad economic forces in their time. So from the revolution, when basically the country was deeply in debt, and the state as such had practically no resources to support higher education. I probably left you with the impression that this University of the State of Pennsylvania was controlled by the state in exchange for state aid. Yes, but the state aid was minuscule. And that institution was impoverished compared to the College of Philadelphia that preceded it and the University of Pennsylvania that followed it, despite the fact that they had taken over all the assets. So even economically or financially, the state had a very limited ability to support higher education institutions in this period. It's not really until you have a few universities like the University of Vermont, the University of Georgia, the University of North Carolina that are chartered in this period, but they're not actually as public institutions, but they're not actually able to support themselves or students until much later in any real way. And so these institutions, even when they are quasi-public institutions, rely on student demand and tuition payments, really, to support themselves, which itself heightens competition between institutions. It breaks down the possibility of a state monopoly over higher education by supporting only a few, and instead opens the space to many. Which leads to your other question, sort of about how dissensus itself can be a force for innovation in the sector and possibly within institutions. I love that question because I think it points us to one of the great puzzles they felt in the first half of the 19th century. One could argue maybe the whole 19th century, which was how to preserve a space for to use your reference of scientific innovation in universities in a time when the financial demands of science are growing. In other words, to support scientific innovation, it's going to cost more and more money. You need more people, more apparatus, more resources just for the scientific endeavor itself to grow. And so the question for them was, can the state support, let's just say, science without exerting sort of a suppressive effect on innovation because of directing the direction of scientific inquiry itself, basically to serve particular state interests. And for historians of science, this often comes down to a debate about scientific ideas versus the political economy of scientific institutions. And scientific institutions increasingly required more money, often on the scale that only the state could offer as the 19th century unfolds. But scientific ideas within the institution, they hope to protect from undue political or government constraint. And that became one of the, I think, great puzzles for scientific institution building in the 19th century. I think we still actually see debates about that today. And one of the things that we're seeing with the Trump administration is universities worrying that their big federal grants are going away because they had come to believe that they could do genuine science even with federal money. Now the federal government has imposed strong ideological constraints on that money. And so they're asking themselves anew whether science as such, the ideas of science, can operate within institutions that rely on that level of state support. And I think the answer remains to be seen how we'll resolve this in the 21st century. But I think the basic question is the same.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's great.
Yeah, Adam, I want to follow up on that question. It seems that there's a dichotomy between the state and also the private. But given the conditions that we are facing about the downturn of global economic conditions, and whether the state would have the capacity in supporting, university funding. And even so, some worry is about the intervention of the state through the funding support to university. When you mentioned in your talk about ideological, constraint, but it seems to us that when some regions like Asia, when the government is committed and with a very strong investment in education, people would have also speculate about the state control. So I just wonder, how would you respond to that? And at the same time, how to, as an historian, what would then be your advice for contemporary university in terms of the governance? Thank you.
Great. For me, this is one of the reasons I like looking at these questions in a more distant historical period, because they became slightly more manageable in scale. So if we look at the first, let's say, quarter, maybe half of the 19th century in the United States, this is a period of early stage industrialization. We might say the first industrial revolution, as opposed to the second industrial revolution at the end of the 19th century, or the third industrial revolution with computerization in the 70s and 80s, and now the fourth industrial revolution of the basically Internet of Everything and artificial intelligence, superintelligence. In the first stage, science in the United States received, from our perspective, very little government support, much to the concern of scientific leaders like President Thomas Jefferson, who wanted to find ways for the national state to support scientific innovation on a greater scale. But the Constitution put constraints on the federal government's ability to support science directly. The revenues of the national government were not equal to the perceived needs of scientific development. And so the question was, how then to support science on a larger scale to make the new United States, the still relatively new United States, more competitive internationally. The United States was strategically and militarily vulnerable. It was economically weak compared to the great powers of Europe, of course, but aspired to stability. Well, in that period, much of the support for scientific work came from private subscriptions. A university or a set of entrepreneurs would ask for support from subscribers. Sometimes they were investors who would expect a return, but much more often they were philanthropically oriented donors who provided resources to support a scientific endeavor. It might be the building of a laboratory. It might be a scientific expedition. It might be the acquisition of apparatus or instruments or equipment for scientific work. It might be simply to pay the scholars who did the work themselves. And this is where I think it's very useful to try to put ourselves in their political and even moral economy, whereby they believed strongly that as philanthropists, they were motivated by a commitment to the public good, that their individual interests would be served and allied with the national interest, which in turn would be served by the advancement of science. Now, we can have wonderful discussions and debates about whether their sense of philanthropic virtue matched their sense of themselves. But that public spiritedness that led what we would now construe as private investment in science had, from their perspective, a fundamental public good orientation. Mm. Now, science is on such a scale that philanthropic support for science pales in comparison to state support because of the sheer size and scope of our scientific endeavors. And it almost seems impossible, even with highly concentrated wealth in private corporate hands, to equal the demands of science and scientific support from the state. So for me, what I think is important to ask, related to your very important question, is if we're worried about the state politicizing science or exerting undue influence over the scientific agenda for not just the nation, but even for humanity, where do we look alternatively for a less politicized or less well, just let's say less politicized form of support? And I'm open to suggestions on that front, because right now we have backed ourselves into a corner where it's common to say that all sources of support are politicized and that all are interested in a way that could compromise the integrity, which is highly idealized, of enlightened scientific endeavor. And that's the moment I think we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, you point out about the importance about public good in higher education is definitely a key, issue that I think not only government but also other sector non-governments have to think about. So thank you very much. I hand over back to Professor David Mills. Anything you want to ground up before we end the session, David?
Thank you, Kaho, and thank you, Adam, for a really, really fascinating presentation. I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in, but I think you've helped us sort of remind us of the importance of that deep history and and being able to see beyond the sort of the froth of the present. So that's great. So next week, Kaho, you're going to talk in this series, and then we have one final one with Wenchen Chen on the 23rd of December. So everyone's most welcome to carry on this series. I think we'll be going from the deep past to the more present, and then obviously to thinking about the transnational with China as well. But I mean, remains to say that we will put these slides, if you could send us those, Adam, so up on our website with the recording tomorrow. And we'll also make sure that we publicize this for people who've missed it so they can catch up. And all our videos, all our podcasts, all our webinars are on the website. And one final note is we have a conference. We have a conference next April, and you're all welcome to register now. Registration's open. You can join online. We've got 30 panels over 2 days. I'd like to have more history, but in the meantime, we've got lots of stuff from across the world. So please do join us for that. Thanks again, Adam. Thank you, Kaho, for chairing.
Yeah, thank you.
See you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Adam.